He thinks he is MAGA. He's said as much very recently. And he said he's going to be in charge of Venezuela. He can, his aides are saying he can invade Greenland any day now if he wants to, or not even invade, just take control. And stuff it. And I think all his eyes now are on expansionism and his legacy.
European leaders, including Keir Starmer, have told President Trump that Greenland belongs to its people and not the United States. That statement came in the last half an hour. It follows growing rhetoric from the White House. Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller has said that Denmark wouldn't fight the US for its territory.
It has been the formal position of the US government since the beginning of this administration, frankly, going back into the previous Trump administration, that Greenland should be part of the United States. The president has been very clear about that. That is the formal position of the U.S. government.
Right, but can you say that military action against Greenland is off the table?
It wouldn't be military action against Greenland. The Greenland has a population of 30,000 people, Jake. The United States should have Greenland as part of the United States. There's no need to even think or talk about this in the context that you're asking of a military operation. Nobody's going to fight the United States.
Well, Donald Trump is expected to address Republican politicians shortly. He has been buoyed by the success of recent American operations to capture the Venezuelan president. This is a dispute, though, between two NATO states. In a moment, we'll hear from the alliance's former head of policy planning, Fabrice Potier. But first, let's go to the US and join Sarah Baxter, director of the Mary Colvin Centre for International Reporting. A very good afternoon from us in London, Sarah. Greenland isn't a narco-state. It is not headed by a man who appears to have many criminal connections. It isn't posturing against America. Nobody should confuse America's actions in Venezuela with any potential actions in Greenland.
Well, the thing about Greenland is it's so much easier to conquer, in inverted commas, than Venezuela. I mean, that really could be an operation where the US just moves in and takes control, because as Stephen Miller said, there's only a very small population there. It's mostly a lot of ice and, by the way, rare earth minerals and all kinds of things that Donald Trump covets. There's a lot more concern about Venezuela and the idea of a forever war there, or at least a lot of instability that the US taxpayers will be on the hook for. Now, of course, there were huge demonstrations only a few months ago against Donald Trump, called the No Kings protests. But it's almost like these should be updated to say No Emperor, because increasingly he does seem to want to add countries to his belt. And he doesn't really care anymore what MAGA thinks about that, the idea of getting into, difficult forever wars. He thinks he is MAGA. He's said as much very recently. And he said he's going to be in charge of Venezuela. He can, his aides are saying he can invade Greenland any day now if he wants to, or not even invade, just take control. And stuff it. And I think all his eyes now are on expansionism and his legacy in these 3 years that he has left as president. That's if he doesn't decide to upend the Constitution and stand again or prolong his term. So this is the period that we're entering now.
It's interesting what you say there, Sarah, about the fact that he doesn't appear to care about MAGA anymore. He believes himself to be MAGA, and his approval ratings are extremely low, aren't they? So are you saying that he's just gone into that place where he no longer feels the need of the people to adore and love him? And that is a dangerous place, isn't it, for any leader to find themselves in?
Well, first of all, he loves himself most of all, and he wants to go down in the history books as, one of the greats in his view. He's always comparing himself to Washington and Lincoln and suggesting that he might be better than either of them. So this is one of his ambitions. Now, regarding his popularity ratings, I mean, Reuters Ipsos had a very interesting poll just in the last day or two, where it came out with, say, 1 in 3 voters opposed intervention in Venezuela. 72% of Americans feared what the consequences might be. But a fairly, low, but nevertheless, majority of Republicans are sticking with him on this, as they will on many issues. And his approval ratings, interestingly, rose from 39% in December to 42% just now. Now, that might be just statistical noise. 42% is still very low. But of course, there's always a bit of American pride in the military achieving something very fast and well. These do not, though, I should say, compare to the kind of approval ratings that President Bush got in the early days of invading Iraq and Afghanistan, and then we all know what happened.
Yeah, but it's important, isn't it, to understand what happened there. And what do you think might happen now in Venezuela?
Well, Donald Trump has very recently said, he may reiterate this when he speaks this morning, that he is now in charge. Asked by NBC who runs it, he said, I run it. But can he really run it from abroad with his satraps and, with keeping the existing regime minus Nicolas Maduro in place? I mean, there are so many questions there. And I do think the American public, while wanting to be supportive, is genuinely bewildered by the fact that this didn't seem to be the Donald Trump they were voting for. By the way, today is January the 6th, and it was 5 years ago to this day that the storming of the Capitol occurred, and that event is being completely airbrushed from history now.
Yes, it's as if the zone is flooded. Good to talk to you, Sarah. Thank you. That's Sarah Baxter, Director of the Mary Colvin Centre for International Reporting. Well, let's bring in Fabrice Potier, former head of NATO policy planning, now Chief Executive of the Rasmussen Global Consultancy. A very good afternoon from us in London, Fabrice. We've never seen a confrontation like this between NATO states before. What do you make of it?
Well, I would not talk of confrontation. I would talk of more tension and a real question mark as to whether Donald Trump is going to put into action his own statements and the statements of his own officials. And that will cross a very significant red line, which is the major ally, the United States, going after another ally's territory. And I think the Danish Prime Minister is spot on when she says that this will be probably the end of NATO, at least the end of NATO the way it has been conceived all along. So I think we're in one of those quite, I would not say dramatic hour, probably pre-dramatic hour, but we're one of those moments where everybody's holding their breath.
Yeah. And you say it's not a confrontation. I think many people will say yet, because if you have a man like Stephen Miller saying, hey, there are only 30,000 people, there's a kind of ... after that, isn't there? I mean, it sounds like very threatening language on the one hand, promising language on the other, depending on whose side you're on.
Yes, absolutely. But I think Stephen Miller is one of the more hawkish voices in the White House, and clearly a voice that has gained even more influence than during the first Trump mandate. And he was also one of the few senior officials who was in the secret of the preparation for the Venezuela operation. So I think we have to take everything they say seriously, because indeed Donald Trump is often quite coherent between what he says and what he does. They are not, however, talking about military operation. They have not deployed, like they did during many months, a major fleet or major military operation in the coast of Venezuela. So we are not looking at the same scenario here, the same pre-deployment. However, I think what I get, I work also in Copenhagen. We have one of our main offices there, is that he feels strongly about Greenland. And it's not just about economics. It's not about critical raw materials. It's this kind of the bully who wants to feel safe in his own hemisphere. And it's very psychological, very personal. And against that, it's really hard to have rational arguments, because if you look at the current defense agreement between the US and Denmark, it's actually very open and very flexible to whatever the US would like to do there.
Yeah.
It's just, I think it's not about military presence. It's about owning that piece of land.
Do you know, Fabrice, when the last time was that the 30,000 people of Greenland were asked very specifically for their thoughts on America being more involved in their country? I mean, it is not a country that has had the easiest of relationships with Denmark.
Absolutely. And there have even been different prime ministers, Danish prime ministers, who have apologized on the record for profound mistakes that were made by Copenhagen vis-à-vis the Inuit population, the Greenlandish population. However, the paradox, it's a bit like Putin in Ukraine. The more Putin invades Ukraine, the more Ukrainians feel. And it's a bit the same with the Greenlanders. The more Trump threatens to take over Greenland, the more they feel Greenlanders, and the more actually they get closer to Copenhagen, where you're right, the relationship has not been easy, but it's actually got better over the past few months because of this threat that is looming on the continent.
There have been some very firm words of condemnation for any aggression towards Greenland that have come out of the meeting of European leaders in Paris today. But how specifically do you think the Danes need to react? How much of a voice, just their voice alone, do we need to hear at the moment?
Well, first, we should not hear only Danish voices. That's obvious. There has to be unity, European unity or around this, because this is not just about the Greenland territory. It's about the principle that could be a fundamental principle that could be broken if the United States were to annex Greenland. And for that, Europe has to stand very firm and very clear. However, where we are in a tough spot, quite frankly, is we don't really have the capabilities, obviously, to respond to a possible U.S. military incursion. And the U.S. is still the main guarantor of European security for the European allies. So we're in a really tough spot, and we have to be very firm in the diplomatic language. And I think this is what this statement is saying. But in terms of action, we have to tread a very thin line.
How unhelpful do you think it might be to our NATO allies that our Prime Minister has been, in many people's eyes, a bit flabby in his response to America's capture of the Venezuelan leader? And what does that mean to the respect that we should all have of international law?
Well, frankly, I think he's not an exception. Sadly, I think most European leaders have been quite flabby. Why? I think Ukraine is very much on their minds, and as you know, today they are hosting a coalition of the willing meeting in Paris, where they're trying to get the US position better aligned with the European and the Ukrainian one. So I think they're trying not to compromise this very painful but relatively successful rapprochement between Washington and Europe and Kiev on some of the fundamental principles of a possible peace resolution. So I think this is probably playing a lot, because President Macron's reaction to the Venezuela incursion was also very flabby, frankly. And I think he could have said, listen, nobody likes Maduro. He's actually an illegitimate leader. However, the ways to topple him are not acceptable under international law. But I think they were trying to keep the US delegation from coming to Paris and having a productive discussion on Ukraine, which is, quite frankly, a much more existential issue for the Europeans, including the United Kingdom, than Venezuela.
Thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon. That's Fabrice Potier, who's former head of NATO policy planning.